Hello everyone, Mr. B here, and it's finally time for the last unit exam, which is Unit 4. Now this isn't the last exam, there is the final, though relatively speaking, a lot of people find the final exam to be the easiest, so don't worry about that one, and there will be a review coming. But this is the last exam that kind of covers new material that we just went over, so chapters 10, 11, and 13. So let's get right into it, but first, disclaimer, I'm going to be going through everything relatively quickly because this just serves as a review, not the actual content. If ever you have any questions regarding anything I go over, please go back to the other videos that I've done that goes into way more detail. Or, as always, you can send me a message. But we're going to start with stress! And the first thing that you are going to need to know is the definition of stress. How do we define stress in psychology? And so it is the pressures or demands placed upon us to adjust or adapt to our environment. So that's what you'll need to know involving stress. When we break down stress, though, there's multiple things that you will need to know. So this whole idea of a hassle, the idea of frustration, the idea of acculturative stress, and then something very specific for life events. So you get a lot of information for a lot of questions from the exam on this slide. So you will need to know a hassle and kind of an example of it. So these are just kind of common annoyances, teeny little things that add up over time. So just kind of minor inconveniences. When we talk about frustration, though, on the other hand, a frustration is when it's an emotional state that we have when our efforts to pursue our goals are blocked or thwarted. So, you have something in mind, you're trying to do something, and then something blocks you. That causes frustration. So make sure you know those two differences, because there's going to be two separate questions about those things. When we talk about a life event, what you will need to know for this is when they surveyed people in college and were looking to see what life event caused the most stress, it was unfortunately rape. So you will need to know that for this exam. And then the last thing that is on this slide, though I'm going to be coming back to another thing that, as I've just realized, is also on this slide, is acculturative stress. So this is the whole idea of, moving to a new culture and having to adapt, causing stress. What you'll need to know is things that help. So including economic opportunities, language proficiency, ethnic identification, and a supportive social network. I can tell you right now for the exam, it'll be, find the odd one out. There will be some other factor that does not help, and it'll be the one that isn't mentioned here. The other thing, just to mention very briefly, though I believe I also have a slide about it, when we talk about type A behavior patterns for stress, the thing to know about that is it puts you at higher risk for coronary heart disease. And then another thing, though I know that there's another slide, is when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, there's certain symptoms, but we'll get there. All right, another type of stress is conflicts. You're going to have two questions that relate to this on the exam. The first one has to do with this first type, known as the approach-approach conflict. This is when you just have two different options, so two different things that you can do, and they're both pleasing. You're motivated. You want to do them. Classic example of this, which I gave in class, is let's say that you go to a movie theater, and there's two different movies that you want to see, but you can only pick one, given, the time that you're there. Both options are pleasing, but you can only pick one. That's approach-approach. Both options are approachable, and it causes a conflict. The other one that you will need to know about is this multiple approach avoidance. And what this means is, again, you have multiple options, but they are both approachable and avoidable. So regardless of the options you pick, there's kind of a positive and a negative to both sides. So they're both attractive and unpleasant. And the example that I gave in class was going to college versus not going to college and just going straight to the workforce. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, but you can only pick one. And so that's another type of conflict. All right, as I mentioned, coming back to a source of stress, traumatic events. Specifically for the sake of the exam, you will need to know about post-traumatic stress disorder, and you'll just need to know the symptoms. So it'll give a list of the symptoms, and you need to find the odd one out. So for examples, you see kind of an avoidance of cues, impaired functioning, you have heightened arousal, but then emotional numbing. And that's something I just want to draw your attention to. Your emotions are numbed, like you don't really respond to as much anymore. But that's different from heightened arousal. Heightened arousal just means that you might startle easily. So keep that in mind when working on the exam. Next thing, as I mentioned, was the type A behavior pattern. And the thing to know about this is if you happen to have this type of behavior pattern, you're at higher risk for a coronary heart disease. Next thing, and there's actually 2 questions that relate to this, is the body's response to stress, which was created by Hans Selye, which is the general adaptation syndrome. One question, you will need to know what those stages are, how your body responds. And so it's the alarm stage, then resistance, and then exhaustion. So that's one thing. The other thing that you will need to know is when our fight or flight response kicks in, and that is the very first thing is the alarm stage. So that's when our body, our sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight kicks in, is when you realize that there is a stressor. The thing that you will need to know about this, that also goes with how our body responds to stress, is that it essentially starts with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what communicates with the rest of our endocrine system to then help us respond to stress. So remembering that it's the hypothalamus that kind of starts our response to stress. Then we get into this idea of lymphocytes. A lot of people know what antibodies is, but we don't learn as much about lymphocytes. And the thing to know specifically about lymphocytes, they are specialized white blood cells that protect the body against diseases. So antibodies kind of mark kind of foreign agents, antigens, things like that, but it's the lymphocytes that actually protect the body and actually fight those diseases. Then we have psychological moderators of stress. You will just need to know kind of some examples of this, which you will see up here. So social support, self-efficacy, perception of control or predictability, psychological hardiness, and optimism. And then going one step further, another thing you will need to know for that psychological hardiness is then kind of the 3 main parts of it, kind of known as the 3 C's of psychological hardiness. So that commitment, that openness to challenge, and that internal locus of control. Going back to coronary heart disease, you'll need to know some risk factors. So you see smoking, high blood pressure, overweight, physical inactivity, high blood glucose, high LDL cholesterol or bad cholesterol, and alcohol use. So there'll be a question that kind of has the odd one out. So knowing what the risk factors are will help you for that. And then the last thing you will need to know for this chapter has to do with reducing cancer risk. And this one is always worded a little confusingly, where you just need to focus on the answers that are given. And just one thing I want to draw your attention to, while alcohol obviously is not something that is recommended for reducing risk of cancer, if you happen to drink, is what this is talking about, is if you do use alcohol, to limit yourself to 1 drink per day for women and 2 drinks per day for men. So keep that in mind when taking the exam. So that's chapter 10. Now we're going to get into chapter 11, which had to do with personality. And so you'll need to know what personality is. And so it is this relatively stable kind of collection of psychological characteristics and behavioral patterns that account for our individual and consistency over time. So you'll need to know that. And then we look into different people and how they view our personality. You'll need to know Freud and his structures of personality, and we will come back to Freud a few times in this chapter. But the first thing you'll need to know is his structures of personality, and they are up here. So the id, the ego, and the superego. Those are his structures of personality. Freud also came up with defense mechanisms, and you will need to know what those are. And it's written up here. Defense mechanisms prevent anxiety if troubling thoughts reach our awareness. I realize reach kind of fell off. There we go. So preventing anxiety of troubling thoughts reach our awareness. That's what we mean by having defense mechanisms. The other thing that you will need to know that was developed by Freud is the psychosexual stages. And you will have 5 questions that relate to this. You'll be given 5 kind of different examples, and you'll just need to know what stage goes where. I will tell you right now that each one is only used once, so keep that in mind. I would pay attention to the age range, because that will help you with some of them. The erogenous zone, that will also help. There is one question that talks about elimination. What that means is the release of bodily waste, also known as pooping. So keep that in mind when you're reading it and you hear elimination. That's what they mean in that context. So just looking at these, the oral, the anal, the phallic, the latency, and genital. Keep in mind the ages, keep in mind the erogenous zone, and keep in mind some of the adult characteristics that can happen, and that will help you with those questions. Then we get into the Neo-Freudians. The thing to know about Carl Jung is he had the idea, and what he added was this idea of the collective unconscious. So he is known for the collective unconscious. Another Neo-Freudian is Alfred Adler. And the thing that I would focus on, because he was all about kind of bettering yourself, but through goal-seeking behavior. So you had this creative self, but you were also kind of goal-seeking. You know, you wanted to feel superior, you wanted to feel significant, and so you sought out these goals. And so that was Alfred Adler. Then we got into the idea of traits, which is kind of a breaking down of our personality. So relatively enduring personal characteristics, you will need to know that definition. And then there's some people that had different ideas as to how we break down our traits. So Allport had the idea that there was 3 main types of traits, which you will need to know. So the cardinal traits, the central traits, and then the secondary traits. So you will need to know that for Allport. And then for Cattell, what you will need to know, and it's kind of hard and it's kind of written very small up here, but he believed that there were 16. So he had the 16 personality factor, or the 16 PF, for his idea of the different factors that made up personality. Then there's this idea of reciprocal determinism. This is the whole idea that these 3 things, cognition, behavior, and the environment, interact and influence one another. So they all influence one another. So cognitions can affect behavior just as much as behavior affects cognition, etc. Then when we're looking at kind of more overview theories of personality, this is something we have talked about before, and sneak preview, it's going to also be on the final exam. But the humanistic perspective, again, you will need to know those names, and so to think Rogers and Maslow. The way I always remember it is, again, Carl Rogers was an amazing human, so humanistic, so that will help you with the names. And then Maslow is the one that did the hierarchy of needs. And then we talk about different ways that we are testing personality. And so there are 2 examples of projective tests, which you got to do in class. And so what you will need to remember is that the thematic apperception test was done by Murray. And then when we talk about the Inkblot tests, they were done by Rorschach. So now we get into the final chapter of chapter 13, which had to do with psychological disorders. And before we got into psychological disorders, we had to talk about abnormal behavior. And so with abnormal behavior, you will need to know what the criteria is. So what are different factors that play a role into categorizing abnormal behavior? And you can see a lot of them here. 2 I want to draw your attention to. The first one is the unusualness. And a behavior can be unusual but not abnormal. So this is one criteria that is not enough on its own to classify abnormal behavior. So please keep that in mind. Just because someone is unusual does not mean it's an abnormal behavior. The other thing to draw your attention to is this idea of a faulty perception or interpretations of reality. And so an example of this is if you're like hearing voices that demean you, and they say, you're hearing voices in your head that say that you're not good enough. This would be an example of a faulty perception or interpretation of reality. Then we get into various models of abnormal behavior. And so we're going back to Freud. Freud is the one that had the psychodynamic, and he believed that abnormal behavior was an outward expression of inner turmoil from your unconscious. So again, that was Freud and the psychodynamic. Another one to draw your attention to is the behavioral model, and this is the whole idea that, again, the behavior is learned or acquired through experience. So just like normal behavior, the idea is that abnormal behavior is also learned. Yes. Then we get into the sociocultural model of abnormal behavior. The thing to know about this is it's saying that things like social class, poverty, ethnic and cultural background, racial and gender discrimination, all of these play a role in potential abnormal behavior. And so an example of this is that we do see an increase in anxiety and depression of those that live in poverty. So those that are impoverished seem to have an increase in certain psychological disorders, is some evidence for this model. And then we have the biopsychosocial model. The thing to know about this is that it is the most comprehensive model, mainly because it's a combination of, in a sense, three models combined. So of course it's going to be the most comprehensive because it has three main things combining together. We also talk about the diathesis stress model. This is the whole idea that you have a predisposition or a vulnerability for a certain psychological disorder, and what brings it out, what makes it manifest itself, is some sort of a stress. So the whole idea, again, the diathesis is a predisposition or vulnerability, and then through stress, it brings about that psychological disorder. So that is the thing that I would know. And then finally, for classifying mental disorders, we have the DSM. And again, be very, very careful on this question because psychological disorders is also an option. But the DSM is more wide range. Psychological disorders are just a part of disorders in the DSM. When you talk about intellectual disorders, that's a type of mental disorder. So when you get to this question, remember that the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is looking at mental disorders and classifying mental disorders, not just psychological. Now we actually get into some of the disorders. So the first one has to do with an anxiety type disorder, which is a phobia. So I would remember what a phobia is, which is this irrational or excessive fear of a particular object or situation. We also talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. And so we talked about that in more detail, where you have these obsessions and these compulsions. So an example of this is when you just have this nagging feeling like you're forgetting something and that feeling just won't go away and it happens over and over and over again. That's obsessive compulsive disorder. Going into a different classification of dissociative disorders, and I apologize that text is a little weird, we have dissociative identity disorder. And so this is when you kind of become a different person. So you have these different, distinct personalities, these different people, and you become them. So remember that for the exam. Then when we get into somatic symptoms and related disorders, there's a very specific symptom known as la belle indifference, or if you pronounce it in French, la belle indifference. And this is the whole idea that you just have this lack of an emotional reaction or concern to something. So to put it more specifically, it is a functional neurological symptom disorder when you are not concerned with the symptom. So you have the symptom, but you're not concerned about it. And that is la belle indifference. Then we get into mood disorders. And kind of the most widely known one is depression. So knowing the symptoms of depression will help you for the exam. You'll be getting kind of an anecdote, and you'll have to diagnose what that person has. So just knowing what symptoms there are for major depressive disorder will help you. Then we get into schizophrenia. There are two questions about this. One is kind of one of the symptoms of schizophrenia, which is a delusion. And a delusion is when you hold a fixed but false belief. So you have this belief, you're very firm about it, like nothing will change your mind, but it does not seem to be held in any fact. That is a delusion. And then the other thing you'll need to know for schizophrenia looks at more the biological aspect of it, and that we see that for those that suffer from schizophrenia, there's an oversensitivity of dopamine. So we see this imbalance of dopamine in those with schizophrenia. Very last thing that we talked about is personality disorders. So the first thing that you will need to know is how we classify them. So similar to the definition of personality, but slightly different, personality disorders is when your personality is rigid. And so it does not change no matter what, which is how that differs from just a regular personality. So a rigid personality that impairs an individual's ability to adjust to the environment. So just an extremely rigid pattern of behavior is the thing to know for personality disorder. And then one example that we gave was antisocial personality disorder. And again, very similar to what I said earlier, kind of knowing the symptoms of this will help you for the exam. So when we look at antisocial personality disorder, a lot of times you see irresponsible behaviors because they do not care. You see a lack of empathy for others because, again, they do not care. And a lack of remorse because, again, they do not care. They kind of see what they want and they will do whatever it takes to get what they want. And that is it. So I'm going to bring myself back. There we go. So that is all that you will need to know for exam 4. I wish you all best of luck. Again, please take your time with it. Let me know if you have any questions while you're taking it. These aren't meant to be difficult. And please keep in mind that unfortunately the final exam is just around the corner since we have covered all of the material minus one chapter, chapter 14, which I will be going over in the review for the sake of time. But I wish you all the best of luck with the Unit 4 exam.